In the last video, we looked at Plato's life, his background, and the world in which he lived. In this video, we turn to one of his most famous works, the Apology, which gives us our clearest picture of Socrates himself. Now, when we hear the word apology, we tend to think of saying sorry for something. But in ancient Greek, apologia means a defence, not an expression of regret. Plato's Apology is therefore an account of Socrates' defence at his trial in 399 BC, when he was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and of not recognising the state-sanctioned gods. It is not, strictly speaking, a dialogue. Apart from a short exchange with one of his accusers, Miletus, the text is more like a single extended speech. Philosophically, it is less complex than some of Plato's later dialogues, but it is a remarkable introduction to both Socrates' ideas and to his character. On the one hand, it is easy to admire his courage, his willingness to die for the sake of truth. On the other, it is equally easy to see how infuriating he could be. Socrates constantly questioned people who claimed to be wise, often leaving them embarrassed or exposed. He described himself as a kind of gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of the Athenian state. Without him, he said, Athens might fall into a deep sleep of complacency. With him, it would be forced to stay awake, to examine itself, and to act with virtue. His task, as he saw it, was to provoke others into thinking more deeply about what they believed. When the jury eventually condemned him to death, Socrates accepted the verdict calmly. He told the court that no one but the gods knows what happens after death, and that it is foolish to fear what we do not understand. He warned those who voted against him that, in silencing their critic instead of listening to him, they had harmed themselves far more than they had harmed him. This is what later came to be known as the Socratic paradox, that the wrongdoer is always harmed more than the person wronged. And if one thinks about what one becomes as a result of one's wrongdoing, a murderer, rapist, adulterer, and the like, one can see how this lasts for the rest of one's life. The charges brought against Socrates tell us a great deal about the Athens of his time. The first charge linked him to the natural philosophers, thinkers who tried to explain the world in physical or mechanical terms rather than by appealing to the gods. In traditional Greek religion, the gods were responsible for everything that happened. They sent storms, decided victories and defeats, and punished wrongdoing. But philosophers such as Anaxagoras and Democritus began to suggest that nature might work through impersonal forces, fire, air, or atoms, rather than divine will. Socrates, however, was not really one of these natural philosophers. He was not interested in explaining the movement of the planets or the causes of thunder. His concern was ethical rather than physical. He wanted to know how people ought to live and what justice, courage, and virtue really were. The second charge, that he corrupted the youth, was equally revealing. Athens was becoming more democratic, and in this new environment, persuasion mattered more than birth or privilege. Skilled speakers could gain political influence. This created a market for professional teachers called sophists, who trained young men in the art of rhetoric, how to win arguments and succeed in public life. But these teachers were often accused of valuing persuasion over truth, much like those who work in political spin these days. Socrates was deeply suspicious of them. He rejected the relativism of the sophist Protagoras, who famously said that man is the measure of all things, suggesting that truth is whatever each person or each culture decides it is. For Socrates, truth was not relative. It was something to be discovered through reasoned dialogue. He believed that the aim of conversation was not to win, but to learn. One of the most memorable elements of the Apology is what later came to be called Socratic irony. According to the story, the oracle at Delphi once declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. Socrates, puzzled by this, set out to prove the oracle wrong. He questioned politicians, poets, and craftsmen, people who were thought to be wise, and he found that, while they all claimed knowledge, they could not justify it. In the end, he concluded that he was wiser than they were only because he knew that he knew nothing. This insight became central to Socratic philosophy. True wisdom, Socrates believed, begins with recognizing one's own ignorance. His humility was not weakness but strength. It stripped away pretense and made honest inquiry possible. That, perhaps, is why his conversations could be both humorous and deeply unsettling. Another of Plato's dialogues, the Crito, continues the story of Socrates after the trial. Here we find him in prison, awaiting execution. His friend Crito visits and begs him to escape, explaining that the plan is already arranged. Socrates refuses. He argues that as a citizen he has benefited from the laws of Athens all his life, and therefore has a duty to obey them, even when they are applied unjustly. To flee, he says, would be to harm the very laws that made his life possible. He would rather die unjustly than commit injustice himself. This argument has fascinated philosophers ever since, because it seems to conflict with what he said in the Apology, where he openly criticises the court's decision. But perhaps the point is not about obedience to authority as such, but about integrity. Socrates must remain true to his principles, even when it costs him his life. Through the Apology and Crito, Plato gives us not only a portrait of a remarkable man, but also a model of philosophical living. For Socrates, philosophy was not an academic subject, it was a way of life. To question, to test, to examine, this was what it meant to care for the soul. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, these dialogues still challenge us. They remind us that truth and integrity are not always comfortable, that asking questions can be dangerous, and that sometimes the greatest service we can do for our society is to disturb its sleep. In the next video, we will look at how the Socratic method works in practice in Plato's dialogue Lackeys,